The Honourable Phil Goff.
E te mangai o te whare, tēnā koe. Mr Speaker, can I just take 1 minute too to join with others who have formally acknowledged the role of the messengers who will be leaving us this week in Parliament. I've been here a long time, so have many of them, and I want to pay tribute to all of them, in fact, for the loyal and professional service they've given to this House over a very long period of time. They've not only served us, sir, but they have been our friends, and I want to acknowledge them and wish them the best for the future. Mr Speaker, Labor is of course supporting this bill, as we have all acts that have been designed to suppress terrorist action both at home and internationally. And just in this last week, we think of the more than 200 people killed by the bombing in Baghdad. 200 people. I read the story this morning of a little girl who was an innocent victim of that bombing, only identifiable by a small patch of green cloth which her mother recognised from the dress that she had been wearing. And of course, we will do anything in our power to stop that sort of disgraceful and appalling behaviour, supposedly motivated by a cause, religious or political, but most likely motivated by the worst side of human nature, the lust for power and control and an utter disrespect for other human beings. By passing this bill, we will be able to ratify 2 further conventions which enable us to support, through our laws, 14 of the 16 conventions that are opposed to terrorism. But I want to say, sir, that if we look at this in context, the sheer delay in passing this bill that puts into effect 2 conventions that were passed in 2005, which is 11 years ago, shows, I think, that the government believes that at best this sort of legislation only has a partial impact on suppressing terrorism. And I think we should have done this long ago, but I also think that we must go far beyond this sort of legislation if we are to defeat terrorism. And in particular, sir, I think that we need to address the causes of terrorism, the international injustices that give rise to acts of terrorism. It's interesting that the act that promoted the 2 conventions passed in 1998, which are the forerunner for this legislation today, was in relation to a PLO attack on an Italian cruise liner called the Achille Lauro. And there was 1 person killed in that attack, a gentleman by the name of Leon Klinghoffer, who was an American Jewish businessman who was shot in cold blood and his body and his wheelchair dumped over the stern of the ship. And what was recognised after that act was that there was a gap in the law. An act of piracy is an act apparently done to further your private ends, and this was not done for that purpose. So the Rome Convention was passed to ensure that action could indeed be taken against those who committed unlawful acts against ships, and to require the signatories to the treaty that we will be able to ratify by this legislation to extradite or to prosecute the people concerned. So this needs to happen. But actually, when you look at that instance involving the Achille Lauro, you see that it was just 1 further act of terrorism that evolved out of the international failure to resolve the conflict in the Middle East. The fact that 2 peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, have claim over the same piece of land, and that we internationally have never been able to deal with that the cause of that conflict and to find a solution that was mutually acceptable and just to both sides. And clearly, if we are to make a difference in the world, we need to do more than simply apply the patch over the offending that is occurring, which is what this legislation does, and we need to tackle the causes. We also need, sir, to be very careful that we as a country do not exacerbate rather than improve the situations that give rise to terrorism. And I want to give two examples of where countries have exacerbated the cause of terrorism. The first goes back to the 1980s when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and that country has lived under conflict in the 30 years ever since. And we deplored the action, the self-interested action of the Soviet Union at that time. But it's also been raised in this House that most acts of terrorism that are occurring now, including the one that I made reference to, arose out of the decision of the coalition of the willing to invade Iraq in 2003. And I, for one, sir, are proud that this country did not participate in that invasion. We said at the time the grounds did not exist for that action. I was involved with Hans Blix, who was running the organisation to check out whether there were weapons of mass destruction. He told me personally they could find no evidence. The New Zealand Kiwi soldiers on the ground told me they could find no evidence. The New Zealand Security Intelligence Service reported there was no evidence of those weapons. And we said this action will be counterproductive, and it was. We stood away from our erstwhile friends in Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States. We withstood the pressure that they put on us to be part of that invasion, and I am proud that we stood away from that invasion and only worked to provide humanitarian assistance in the aftermath of it. If it were not for that action, we would not have the level of terrorism that has taken hundreds of thousands, probably millions of lives, and which leaves the world today with 70 million displaced people around the world, deprived of the things that we would take for granted in terms of stability, a roof over their head, a job, and peace for themselves and their family. So we need to be careful in the actions that we take internationally. Thirdly, sir, we need to be sure that we here at home address and do not aggravate the conditions that might potentially give rise to terrorism taking root in our country. And tomorrow, I think it will be tomorrow, depending on the sighting of the new moon, our Muslim community will be celebrating Eid al-Fitr. And I know I have many friends in that community, and I know that they tell me people who have been born in New Zealand, who are loyal New Zealanders, who are decent New Zealanders, that daily they have to put up with prejudice and people sneering at their culture, their religion, their dress, and how they observe their religious practices. And the most important thing that we can do as a country is not simply passing legislation like this, but to make sure that our country is an inclusive one, where people respect each other, where people are treated equally, where people have opportunity, and regardless of race, colour and creed, they are treated as New Zealanders with that respect. And I know too that when there is problems in that community, the people that we rely on most to put an end to any potential development of illegal or criminal activity is the Muslim community itself, that come to the police, that come to the government and say, we're worried about this individual, they are a disturbed individual, and we think they're being affected by the propaganda they're seeing online. So we support this legislation, Mr. Speaker. It's legislation that should pass this House unanimously, but we need to think that there are those other things that are far more important for our country to do if we are to defeat the scourge of terrorism and prevent it ever taking root in this country and suppress it where it is happening internationally.
I call Tim.